Hello and welcome to the channel. Today we're going to talk about Power Virtual Agents and extensibility using the Azure Bot Framework, and more specifically Bot Framework skills. Alright, well let's go. Alright, so today's an interesting episode. This one actually took me quite a while to put together just because there's a lot of moving pieces. But as I was going through this, I realized with the amount of moving pieces that are involved, that actually having a video like this was a really good thing. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to take you like step by step through the journey, and I'll be flipping back and forth between slides and sort of demos to show how all of these different pieces get configured and work together. Now, just in terms of this content itself, like why is this content important? And I think one thing is just around like Power Automate, Microsoft Flow, is an extensibility story for Power Virtual Agents, and it's a great one. And I think it's a low-code way of extending your bot. And today what we're really going to talk about is Azure Bot Framework and more of a codeful solution or pro code experience. And that's what makes this a little bit more involved than wiring things up with Power Automate. It certainly makes you appreciate how simple wiring up Power Automate really is. But there's some good reasons to use the Bot Framework. The Bot Framework's been around for a few years, and it is very rich, and there's a lot of things that you can do with a Bot Framework skill that you can't do inside of Power Automate today. And so one is around this idea of like multi-turn experiences, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through it. But like typically with Power Automate is you collect a lot of information up, then you make the call over to Power Automate, it does some work, and then it returns you back. But what happens if you have like different decisions or different logic that your conversation goes through? You don't want to be bouncing back and forth too much between Power Virtual Agents and Power Automate, because you're going to introduce some latency. And so that's where you get into some of these more advanced scenarios where the complexity is a little bit higher. You might want to do what's called a multi-turn experience using Bot Framework, where you're going back and forth, and you can still do that in a very like efficient manner using the Bot Framework itself. Now there's a few other caveats or things I want to call out early before we dive too much into the content. Is that number one, yes, Bot Framework is a pro dev experience. If you don't have Visual Studio and C# and Bot Framework or coding experience, this is probably not the video for you. I'd send you right back to Power Automate and look at those scenarios. I'll save you sort of 20-30 minutes, however long this content lasts. The other thing is when it comes to Azure, and this is where I got a little bit burnt by this yesterday, is I had my Power Virtual Agent running in a different tenant where I didn't actually have any sort of Azure presence. And then naturally I have other tenants where I do have Azure access, through like MSDN subscriptions, that sort of thing. So I tried to sort of connect those two worlds, and it doesn't actually work. So that's another thing I want to put up front. You need to be in the same tenant because you're going to run into an error as soon as you try to import your skills into the PVA experience. Another thing is that once you go ahead and publish your Azure Bot Framework skills and you basically configure them inside of Power Virtual Agents, you will call them through actions, much like you do with Power Automate today. So that experience is going to be pretty similar once you actually go ahead and get there. Before we dive deeper into the content, I wanted to let you know about an emerging community found at serverlessnotes.com. This is a community resource that covers best practices, tips, and latest announcements built on contributions by technology enthusiasts from around the globe. On serverlessnotes.com, you'll find content related to Power Automate, Azure Logic Apps, Azure Service Bus, Azure Functions, and much, much more. Serverlessnotes.com is brought to you by Serverless 360, a portal that is focused on operations and support for Microsoft Azure serverless resources. Now, this is a complementary tool to the Azure portal, and it helps organizations in supporting Azure serverless applications. You can find out more about Serverless 360 at serverless360.com. All right, before we get too deep into the content, I did want to just have a quick shout out to Afarat. Hopefully I pronounced that correctly. But I did run into some of his posts in the community and his blog post here, which will also be linked in the description. And you definitely did save me some time working through some of these issues. So if you find like this video isn't sort of all encompassing, or you want to take a look at another perspective, definitely check out his blog because there's some good stuff on it. So kudos to you, and thanks for contributing to the community. All right, we talked a little bit about this before in the intro, but let's just go a little deeper. Power Automate versus Bot Framework considerations. So I think number one is persona. Now, if you are a developer, you're comfortable with code, you like to write code, perhaps you have some more advanced scenarios you need to deal with, Bot Framework skills might be the answer for you. Me personally, my personal opinion is I'd say start with Flow, Power Automate, see how far you can go with that, and then if you run into a situation where like you can't actually solve it with Power Automate, then go ahead and jump into Bot Framework. Now, we talked a little bit about this in the intro, is single turn versus multi-turn. Single turn meaning like you go ahead and provide info, you get a response right back. Multi-turn is where you might get some part of the conversation, you need to collect more information. Kind of think of it as like you have this big sort of if this, then that sort of scenario, and you want to limit how many times you're actually going back to the client through Power Automate. You could end up with having like tens or, hopefully not, well, definitely not hundreds, but you could have tens of flows depending upon how you model your conversation. That might be a scenario that's just best off using the Bot Framework. One feature today that does exist in Bot Framework that isn't available in Power Automate is adaptive cards. So when you start to see some of those rich experiences about like posting these cards with different actions and image and multimedia, those are things that you can do with Bot Framework, and there's actually samples that are out there that show you how to do all of that. That today inside of Power Automate, you can't do. Inside of Power Automate, you can use adaptive cards and things like Teams, but for Power Virtual Agents, we're typically stuck with your text data at this point in time. Connectivity, and now this leans more so to the Power Automate side, where you've got like this out-of-box connectivity that exists by using all of those different connectors. So for example, you want to create a service desk bot, and you want to be able to connect to, say, ServiceNow. Well, you're going to have the ServiceNow connector that exists in Power Automate, and that's going to be a great experience for you to go ahead and create data in ServiceNow or retrieve data. If you were to do that in the Bot Framework, you're going to be custom coding against all of those REST APIs. So, I would bet that you're going to be able to do that much quicker in Power Automate. Now, another scenario that might lend you more to the Bot Framework side of things is live agent integration. So typically you think of chatbots, you want to solve someone's problem and without involving a human. But the reality is there's going to be some circumstances where you do need to escalate to some sort of live agent. Now, with Power Virtual Agents out of the box, there is omni-channel integration, which is pretty cool. It's a feature in the Dynamics family where you can basically escalate a call to a live agent, and they'll basically be able to converse with that customer or that end user through that integration that exists, and that's pretty cool. But there might be situations where you have third-party solutions and there isn't that direct integration, at least not at this point. You could pipe that in through Bot Framework and actually go about integrating from that perspective. Okay, so I'm going to take you on a bit of a journey here where I will try to go step by step and show you exactly how I went about building my Power Virtual Agent that talks to a Bot Framework skill. So what I would suggest, I'm not going to walk you through how to create a bot itself. There's many examples. That's a much better tool than what I would be able to offer. So go ahead, head over to GitHub. I'll include this link inside of the description of the video, and go ahead and download this package. I'm going to build my bot in C#, but as part of the samples, you're going to find adaptive cards, multi-turn, and even Q&A maker scenarios. So go ahead and do that. Then what you're going to have is you're going to have basically a solution that includes many different projects. And then within all of these projects, you will be able to go ahead and, obviously compile the code and debug the code and basically run it locally. And the best way to do that is through the Bot Framework emulator to test that out. Once again, including that link in the description of the video. So let's just head over to Visual Studio. In this case, I'm using VS 2019. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to just show you the project that I have chosen to use for this example. I'm going to go ahead and use the complex dialog bot. And what it's going to do is it's just going to show you essentially like a multi-turn example of how you can go ahead and collect feedback and then show different dialogues based upon what someone chooses. Now go ahead, build this, and then you can go ahead and run it. And what this is going to do is it's essentially going to spin up almost like a web API where we're going to have a web page running on localhost that we can go ahead and communicate with. And we're going to communicate with it using the emulator that exists. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the emulator. Let's just close a few tabs and start fresh. And I'm going to say open bot. And what we're going to do is use this address here. And then what we want to ensure is we have this endpoint. By default, we always have this endpoint called API/messages, and we're going to go ahead and kick that off. And then at this point, because I have enabled authentication, I am getting an auth error, and what I should have done is when I went to connect, go ahead and provide the app ID and the app password. Okay, through the magic of editing, I've gone ahead and done that. Now, do note, when you go and do this for the first time, you're not actually going to get challenged that way for authentication. This is because I've gone ahead and wired up everything already. So we're going to see later on how we go about getting that app ID and that password. So just hang tight from that perspective. And here within this bot, I can just go ahead and it's prompting me to enter something to get started. I'm just going to say hi. I can say my name is Kent. What is my age? Fictitiously, I'll say 30. And then I can say, oh, I want to choose Contasso Suites to review. And then if there's anything else, I can review them, or I can just go ahead and hit done by typing in 4. And so thanks for participating. So a fairly simple example. That's not really the point. The point of this video is just how do we plug all of these things in together. But what it does prove is we have a working bot. There's no point trying to deploy your bot until you know you have something working, and that solves that requirement. So at this point, we have a working chat bot that's running locally. We're able to debug it and go through the traditional Visual Studio experience of managing all of that. But in order for this to work with PVA, we need to get it into the Azure Bot Framework service. And so that's what we're going to do here in these next couple steps, where we're going to go ahead and create a resource in Azure called a web app bot. So if you go ahead and click on new resource and search for web app bot, you will go ahead and be able to provision that. Now, as part of this process as well, we need to do a couple things. We need to grab the app ID and the app password that are going to be automatically generated for us when we go ahead and provision a web app bot. And those are the values that I needed to include when I pause the recording and when I tried to use the emulator. Those are those two values, so that's where we're going to get it. There's also something we need to clean up on the app AD registration page, and I will show you that in an upcoming slide as well. So here's how you can go ahead and establish a new web app bot. Mileage may vary, it all depends on your scenario. Since this is just a POC, I've gone ahead and I'm using a trial subscription, and I'm going to use the F0 pricing tier, which is essentially the free tier. Not to accumulate costs, I need to provide an app name. In this case, I'm calling it PVA Skills Demo. You'll need to provide your own. And then a bot template does exist, the Echo bot, not actually using it at all, but you could go ahead and just start with that one if you wanted to. And then I also need to create a new app service plan / location, and I've gone ahead and done that. So that's how you go about creating that web app bot, and that will automatically provision you an app service plan under the hood as well. Now, what happens is once this goes through the provisioning process, we will now have a web app bot where we can go ahead and we can now retrieve different pieces of data from the configuration. We can do testing in the web chat and other features as well. Now, just to make this real, this is the actual web app bot that I have provisioned. So we can see the overview. Here we can see the messaging endpoint. This is going to be something that's important down the road here. In addition, we also have the configuration, and this is very important. This is where you're going to want to go ahead and retrieve these values here. So the Microsoft App ID, the app password, you can retrieve them by clicking on Edit. A pop-up will show up that shows them basically unobfuscated. Go ahead, copy those, and paste them into Notepad for now. Okay, so the next step in this journey is those two values that I just showed you how to copy and paste from within the Azure portal. We need to take those values and actually update some properties in the app.config found inside of Visual Studio. So let's flip over to Visual Studio and do that right now. Okay, so I flipped over to Visual Studio, and then in our project, so the complex dialog bot, then we're going to go and double click on appsettings.json. And what you'll find is you'll find these attributes that are essentially empty: Microsoft App ID and then Microsoft App Password. Don't worry about allowed callers. We'll cover that a little bit later. That's another important configuration that we're going to need to populate. But here's where you'd go ahead and populate the app ID, the app password that we retrieved from the Azure portal. So one of the things that happens when you go ahead and create a web app bot that we did in a previous slide is that it automatically goes and creates an app registration in the Azure portal, and more specifically in the Azure AD app registrations. The problem is that there's a few properties that are left unpopulated. So we need to go ahead and fill those out. So let's flip over to the Azure portal. And once in the Azure portal, let's go find Azure Active Directory. Then we'll go ahead and look for app registrations. Then we'll find the one that I had created. Mine was called PVA Skills Demo. Yours will be called whatever you gave for your name in the previous experience when you provisioned the web app bot. Now, once we're here, let's go ahead and click on branding. And this is where we will find the 3 values that we do need to populate. All right, so we're now at the point where we can go ahead and publish our bot to our app service in Azure. Now, this isn't the only time we will publish the bot, but I'm trying to do things very incrementally so that if you do encounter an error, you address it right away. I think if you try to save it all up till the end, you're going to run into some pain, and it's going to be difficult to follow the breadcrumbs and get things sorted out. So let's head over to Visual Studio once again, and we will go ahead and we will publish. Okay, so we are in Visual Studio and we're going to publish, and we can publish by right mouse clicking on our project itself and click on publish. Now I have what's called like a publishing profile already. This is something that you will create. If you haven't created one before, you can just go ahead and click on new. And it's going to ask you whether or not you want to create a new app service or connect to an existing one. In my case, because we already had deployed that web app bot before, we are in good shape. We can select existing. Then we're going to have to go ahead and find the subscription, the resource group, and then the actual app service ourselves for us to go ahead and click and provision to. I'm just going to hit cancel here because I've already done this before. But what you will then have is a screen that looks similar to this. One thing I would suggest, at least initially, is if you do want to debug, go ahead and flip this flag to be debug. What you can do from Cloud Explorer is go ahead and attach a debugger. And especially as you're going through this for the first time, just in case you get errors, being able to debug against the cloud is huge because you'll be able to pinpoint what the error is much simpler than otherwise. You're kind of flying without visibility. So I go ahead and I'll click this publish button, and I will have an endpoint that will basically be displayed to me, and it will basically look similar to this. And then the other thing is to note, whenever you have these endpoints, once again, like that endpoint is going to be API/messages, right? So that's important. And then also notice that at the beginning, you want to ensure that you've got HTTPS as well. But this would allow us to basically connect to our bot itself. And what I now want to show you is like how you can test this using a test harness that does exist inside of Azure. So I'm back over in Azure, and I'm back at my web app bot, and then we can click on the test in web chat. And you can see it's already kicked off. As soon as I clicked on that link, it's going to click off and give me this welcome message. And here I can go ahead and hit hi, and then it's going to ask me those same questions that I showed you previously. So I'm not going to go ahead and go through this exercise, but this will give you a sense that what you've deployed in test or what you've deployed in Azure is actually working. And then we know that we're safe to proceed on to the next. All right, so that was testing within the Azure portal. Now, we need to make another change to the app.config, and this will be the last one. We're also going to establish a manifest file, so I'll explain that here shortly. We will deploy the project to the bot service one more time, and I promise you we're getting pretty close to how we can plug in our bot skill into Power Virtual Agents. Now, one thing you want to do is you need to be able to permit, and basically this is essentially authorization. You need to allow your Power Virtual Agent to talk to your bot. And that gets enabled through that allowed callers attribute that we did see previously in the app settings.json. And so I did show you that before. I didn't explain it. And part of the reason for that is we need to grab a value of our actual Power Virtual Agent and its ID in order to include it in Visual Studio itself. So the way you do that is you navigate over to Power Virtual Agents, and then you hit Manage, and you go ahead and you click on Skills. And you then click on this Provide ID for Allow List, and when you do that, that is where you're going to get this GUID, and this is what you want to copy. Now head back over to Visual Studio, find the app settings.json file, and then populate this in the allowed callers attribute. Do note you need the square brackets. This is meant to be an array, and so that's the notation inside of JSON for arrays. So if you had multiple bots, Power Virtual Agent bots that wanted to leverage the same skill, you could have a string, basically a concatenation of all of those values separated by a comment in order to do so. Right, so the next step is what's called a manifest file. And you can kind of think of this as metadata, and this is, or like just to put it into parallels for those of you who are familiar with Logic Apps or Power Automate, you know how you have Swagger metadata for all of the connectors, especially like custom connectors. You can kind of think of it like that, and you need to have a manifest file in order to go ahead and plug this in to Power Virtual Agents, and it really becomes a contract of all of the inputs and outputs that you will pass in and out of the skill itself. So I found this particular post immensely helpful. This is on the community, the Power Users community for Microsoft, and this is from Pavan, who is a PM on the PVA team. And so he has published a couple sample manifest, and in my case I've got a very simple bot, so I've went ahead and modified the min file, the PVA skill manifest min.json, and I've had to go ahead and just make a few simple changes. I can provide an ID and a name, and naturally I need to include my endpoint URL, including that API messages. I've talked about that before, and then also the MS app ID, which we have talked about in the past. That came from the Azure portal. Also note you can change this description. Do change it, and you're going to see why when I show you the PVA experience a little bit later. Whatever you have here is actually going to surface it when you go ahead and browse for actions. So give that a meaningful name while you are here. Now, what's going to happen, I will show you in Visual Studio shortly where you need to include this file. But this needs to be a publicly addressable file. And when you go ahead and you add this file to your project, your Visual Studio project, you need to publish it, and you need to be able to get the URL. So you will see here, I've created a subfolder called manifest, and then I've called my file PVA manifest.json. You can call it whatever you want, but you need to be able to resolve this in a browser. And if you can't resolve this in a browser, there's no point even going to the next step, so you need to be able to figure that out. So let's flip over to Visual Studio, and I will just show you how I set my file up. Okay, so I'm in Visual Studio, and then you're going to notice that there is a folder called www.root. And as part of that, this is where you get the default.html page that gets rendered that you see whenever you publish your bot. What I did is I just created a new folder. So you right mouse click and basically say open folder in File Explorer. Then go ahead and create a new folder called manifest. And then go ahead and drop your modified file. So I gave you the download link where you can go ahead and find that manifest file. Then go ahead and edit it and then save it here. Publish your app, then you will be able to go ahead and hit it inside of a web browser. And then once you're there, copy that URL because we're going to need it in the next step. Okay, we're almost there. This is the last configuration step. Then you're going to be able to go ahead and use your skill, which is what you wanted to do when you started watching this 25 minutes ago. So inside of Power Virtual Agents, I showed you before where you can go ahead and provide an ID for the allow list. Right beside that, you click the add skill. When you click that button, you will then need to paste the URL of your skill manifest file, which we just spoke about. And then what it's going to go ahead and do is it's going to go ahead and validate your file. If it cannot find your file, or if it's not able to find it, obviously it's going to throw an error. But even if it goes ahead and parses your data, it's going to spit out an error. And now I have gone through like all of the steps, all of the things that hung me up when I went through the first time. I've covered all of those in this video, but things to look for, as I talked about earlier, you need to be in the same tenant. So PVA needs to be in the same tenant as your Azure AD and where your bot is living. That's number one. Number two is when we went into Azure AD and I got you to update the branding where you have the homepage URL, the terms of service, the privacy. Go ahead and make sure you have that set up. The other one is around manifest. Now, I use like the simplest manifest because I'm not actually putting in inputs and outputs. What you will do is there was another full file that was included in the download off of that community page, which shows you how you can go ahead and create more complex manifests that include inputs and outputs. So that would be another thing that you want to go ahead and check. Another thing is that provide the ID for the allow list. So remember when we were in app settings and we had to go update that permit list to include that GUID, that would be another thing that you would need to go ahead and check. Now inside of mine, you can see where I've gone ahead and everything is lined up and it's working. And once you've been able to successfully add the skill, it will actually go ahead and show up here. So finally, we now get to go ahead and use our bot framework skill. And we will find it when we are in the author experience for a specific topic and we go head over to actions, right? So we basically click on the plus sign, say call an action, and in this case we have all of our actions available to us: authentication, flows inside of Power Automate, and then our bot framework skills. And remember when I said update this description to make sure it's relevant and very meaningful? Like this is the result of that, where we can see inside of this PVA bot skill that we have a description that's not overly useful. So do ensure that you update that to have a meaningful description. So let's go ahead, let's flip into the authoring canvas and just see this in action. Okay, so I'm going to head over to topics, and what I've done is I've created a topic just called run demo, just for the the purposes of what's going on here. And to kick this off, I basically have to type in run demo or some variant of that. I'm just going to get a very simple, basically welcome to the demo. Let's just go ahead, let's delete this just to make it look a little bit more, so you can get a better sense of the experience. So call an action. And then let's scroll down, and then there is our specific bot framework skill. Now, can I go ahead and just go ahead and delete this, and then we'll just add a message. And the purpose of this message is just so that you can see when I'm in the bot framework skill and when I'm back in PVA. So let's just go ahead and click on save. And then we can go ahead and run our bot. So we're just going to type run demo. And then you're going to recall, like now we're into the skills demo, right? And so this was the same experience that we saw running locally and also when we were using the test harness inside of Azure. Do note we haven't reached this part where we're back in PVA yet. So I can go ahead and just type in my name, an age. I'm interested in Contoso suites again, and I'm going to be done. And so great. So you can see exactly what were the steps that were being fulfilled inside of the bot framework skill, and what was happening inside of PVA. Naturally, we can go ahead and add flows and sort of use both of these extensibility stories to solve our business need, but it really comes down to requirements and then choosing what is the right extensibility story for you. So hopefully that was a useful demo. I tried to be as comprehensive as possible without going too crazy, but I do think I hit the high points in terms of all of the individual actions and configurations that you do need in order to make this work. All right, well, that was a marathon, and I certainly appreciate you sticking with me throughout the whole journey of this video. If you're not following me on Twitter, I do encourage you to go ahead and do so. I always send out tweets whenever I've got new videos. Feel free to reach out and just ask questions and interact as well. I'm obviously on the YouTube channel right now, so I certainly appreciate it. If you haven't subscribed, please go ahead and click that subscribe button. I recently just surpassed the 400 subscribers. Pretty pumped about that, just having been focused on YouTube the last 3-4 months. And so I'm pretty pumped. And so certainly if you do like this content, give me a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't. Once again, thank you so much for checking out this video. I will see you next week and bring more Power Platform goodness to you. Thanks and take care.